Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the National Forum. I hope all of you had a chance to enjoy the city a little bit last night. I know I saw a few of you a little bit later at one of the restaurants downstairs. So glad to have everybody here again and excited about day 2 and the big issues we're going to be talking about. We've got a plenary session coming up over the next couple of hours on Achievement Gap, one on Every Student Succeeds Act, and one on state financial aid redesign. But to start off, we've got 2 Ed Talks, and I'm really excited to be introducing Brandon Boostede, who we've worked with a lot at the Gallup organization. Brandon might actually have more energy than I have, which is one thing that I love because he's got a lot of important information to share with you from trends that he's utilized and seen across the country. His work at Gallup really focuses on some of the research on science and talent selection, strengths, engagement, and well-being, all focused to improve student success, teacher effectiveness, and educational outcomes. I'm very excited to invite Brandon to the stage, and please join me in welcoming him as our first Ed Talk of the day.
Thank you. All right, good morning. I'm going to try and dial down the energy a little bit just because I don't want to get Jeremy too fired up here. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm just going to dive right into it. This is going to be a synthesis of a ton of research that Gallup has been doing on education. And it's across the whole spectrum, right? Early childhood, K-12, higher ed, and also critically into workforce. And I just want to start with this. Here's the thing that I've become increasingly worried about as I look at all of this. And that is that I think we have overcomplicated this thing we call education. We have greatly overcomplicated it. And I'm not suggesting that it isn't a complex issue or challenge, right? But hopefully I'm going to expand on what I mean by we've overcomplicated it. In fact, so much so that I think we've lost track of the basics, the fundamentals. And I was reminded of this recently by an article I read about the Latin roots of the word education. And I'm going to share these with you because I think they actually get at my point about what we've lost track of. And interestingly enough, they also connect squarely with some of the most important research that Gallup has done. So if you don't know this, there's actually 2 Latin roots to the word education, educare and educera. And here's what they mean literally. The first one is to rear or bring up, almost in a parental loving sense of it, right? To rear or bring up. And the second one, and I really love this one, is to lead out of. Note that it doesn't say anything about stuffing into. I think we've created a wonderful system for stuffing things into students. I don't know that we've created an amazing system for leading things out of them. Their innate potential, the things they're most excited and interested in, their motivation, the things they want to do and be. So I want to start here with this because I want to draw some ties to these Latin roots in our Gallup research and talk about why they're so important, not just because they're the literal roots of this thing we call education, but because there's a pile of research that tells us that these truly may be the 2 most fundamental things we need to get right in education today. And if we're going to do this, I think it's a fundamental shift. And I know this is going to sound, not so crazy coming from a guy at Gallup, but I think it's fundamentally a shift in what we measure. You've all heard the expression, we are what we measure. Well, think about that right now. Think of the things we measure in education. We are what we measure, but I don't know that we're measuring all the things that we value. And I want to start with this point that even though we like to think of ourselves as rational decision makers, right? We think as human beings, we take information, we use that information to make an informed decision. The reality is, and this is explained by the 70-30 ratio, that only about 30% of the decisions we make are based on rational information. So if I decide what college to go to, maybe 30% of that was, I don't know, data I had, a ranking that I looked at, right? Information that I studied about, I don't know, my financial aid package. The reality is that 70% of the decisions we make as human beings are governed by our emotion. Gallup would make this distinction calling that the behavioral economic ledger, compared to the classic economic ledger. And I want to explain these two things because this is where I think we have a huge opportunity. We're doing a decent job right now in education measuring classic economic measures. We're doing a poor job, in fact, barely measuring anything that would fall on this behavioral economic side of the ledger that I'm going to describe. So here's examples, right? When we think about the health of a nation, on the left side are classic economic measures we use to determine the health of a nation, right? Things like GDP or unemployment, for example, right? The percentage of people who are out of work looking for work. By the way, unemployment data is kind of crazy because, see, we drop out of the denominator anybody who's given up looking for a job. People who are so hopeless that they've literally quit looking for a job, we just throw them out of the equation. So when you see data like 5% unemployed, it doesn't really tell you the story of what's going on. How many Americans, by the way, are still employed full-time but dropped out of the middle class? That's a crazy number. So the point about this is these are important metrics for us to understand. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting we stop measuring these things. These are very helpful indicators. But in the grand scheme of things, they don't tell us everything. Think about crime rates, right? Crime rates can go up just because you increased enforcement or added more police to the force. It doesn't really tell me, is crime bad, right? Are more crimes being committed? Not necessarily. They might not just be reported, right? So you see all the problems with that. But now when you think about behavioral economic measures, this is a good one. See, if you looked at GDP in Egypt and Tunisia in the 5 years before Arab Spring, it was going up in both countries. So if one was using that as a judgment of the health of those nations, you would have said things are going pretty well. But Gallup's measures of well-being, how people rate and evaluate their lives, were plummeting in those 5 years. And well-being turned out to be a much stronger predictor of unrest at a country level than GDP. Now, sometimes these things move together. But in those two cases, well-being was going like this while GDP was going like this. And by the way, things like crime rates don't tell you about whether people fear. So we ask a question in our world poll, whether you feel safe walking alone at night. Now, I can only get to that information by asking you that question. I have to ask a citizen that question. They're the only judge of whether they're fearful walking alone at night. And by the way, some people are fearful walking alone at night because they're worried they're going to be beaten by their own police force. But you see how it's important to understand both of these things, not to just measure the classic economic indicators, but to understand how people think and feel about how things are going. I can't measure fear unless I ask people that question directly. It's the only way that I can measure that. And by the way, it's great if you have a job. That's better than no job at all. But what about the difference between a job where you love what you do each day, where you have a chance to do what you're best at each day, where you're developing in that role, right, versus one where you're not? One where you have a horrible manager, right, who discourages you, et cetera. Those are very, very different outcomes for you in those jobs. So we can't just quantify, do people have a job? We need to go deeper in thinking about, are they engaged in that work? There's all kinds of ways to measure this. And as you think about how we do this in education, we've got a simple set of metrics that we measure education by. It really is very simple in the grand scheme of things. And in some form, it boils down to three things: grades, test scores, and graduation rates. These are very important things for us to track. Let me just honor that for a minute. But it misses the full picture of how we're doing. It misses the full picture of success. And I'll just sprinkle a couple crazy stories to you, right? Google, the world's most admired employer, is no longer asking candidates for grades or test scores because they found no relationship between grades and test scores and their success in any job at Google. So they're just done. Think about that for a minute. Now, this is not me saying that this is the end of grades and test scores, but this is me saying that there are several powerful examples that tell us that that should not be the only set of measurement we use to judge the success of a student and a teacher in a school. That in addition to those things, there's a whole bunch of other things that are going on that equate to success that we're obviously not paying attention to. It's not all explained by grades and test scores, but for your typical kid in America today and their parent, they think that that's all there is. It's the end of the world, of course, if they don't get a good score in the ACT or the SAT, right? Because then that means you're not going to get into the great college, et cetera. But what if we started measuring things like whether they're engaged in their learning, not just what the grades are or their test scores? What about their hope, their ideas and energy for the future? These are things that can be measured. Many of you have read Paul Tuff's book. You know about Angela Duckworth's work on grit, right? These are similar constructs. These are behavioral economic measures that, first of all, can be reliably measured, and secondly, matter a lot. And we need to get everybody over that hurdle of understanding those two things. Think about how we do things like we judge the best colleges and universities in the United States. Largely, we put tons of weight on input variables. This is going to sound crazy when I explain it, but it's true. So you get higher rankings as a college or university by turning away more students. There's one interesting thing, right? The more selective you are, the higher you go in the rankings. By the way, the incoming test scores of students in high school and their grades in high school, their high school GPA, are indicators that we put a lot of weight on in saying what's the best college or university. Here's the thing. If you actually wanted to measure the best college and university based on the learning, growth, and development from the time a student matriculates to the time they graduate, we have no idea what the best colleges and universities are because no one has ever systematically measured that. Here's another idea. What if you measured the success of their graduates? There's a lot of different ways you could measure it. I mean, sure, you could just look at income or whatever, but I mean, there's a broad set of indicators we could look at. Wouldn't you think that would be a good way of judging the best college and universities? How their graduates end up doing, right? The product in the marketplace. On that one, we have no idea either. And even if we look at output measures, so here's the point. We use input metrics as a judgment of outcome. That's crazy, right? I'm not saying these input metrics don't matter, but as a judgment of outcome, that's just a silly notion. And even our outcome metrics are becoming increasingly challenged. Here's a good one for you. Did you know the average letter grade in college today is an A? I can't make this up. I mean, like, these could be jokes in other speeches. These are true. I mean, it's like, it's kind of funny and it's kind of not, right? Average GPA in higher ed has gone up 1.1 points in the last 30 years. So I'll just equate this for some of you in the audience. If you graduated 30 years ago with a 2.9, you're really a 4.0. Doesn't that make you feel good? I mean, I felt better when I learned that. I was like, geez. Okay, but of course there's some other little zingers I'll throw in there. Hope, like Angela Duckworth has shown in her research in Grit, hope is a stronger indicator of college completion than test scores and grades. Test scores and grades still count, but hope, their ideas and energy for the future, is a stronger indicator of what powers them through to completion. So we need to be measuring all of these things. Now, as Gallup steps into our research on this, right, and we think about ultimately what are we aiming at, right? Yes, we want kids to graduate, but that's not the ultimate outcome, right? Because if they graduate and don't get a fulfilling job and lead a fulfilling life and become an engaged citizen, you know, those are the things that we're kind of ultimately aiming students at all levels. And so we've done research for decades now trying to quantify two really important things, right? What it means to have a great life, what we call well-being, and what it means to have a great job. Now, I'm not saying this is the end-all be-all measure, but I think they're powerful ideas to understand, right, what it means to have a great job and a great life. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about this. I'm not going to go into great detail, but we've found 5 critical elements to somebody's well-being, how you rate your life, how you experience your life. And what's important about these is these are not just nice things to measure, right? Well-being sounds like a nice thing to measure, like student engagement sounds like a nice thing to measure. These are hard indicators. These are not soft measures. I hate that we use that distinction, right? Soft versus hard metrics, because we kind of throw behavioral economics into the soft category. This is not soft stuff. Because if you have an employee who's thriving in all 5 elements of well-being, the way we measure it, they have 1/3 the healthcare cost burden to their organization than somebody who's not thriving in any. And for every level, you can take somebody from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3 elements of thriving. The healthcare cost burden just keeps going down. Think about our national healthcare tab. It's about $2.9 trillion. That's almost $1 trillion more than the entire GDP of Russia, to put it in perspective. I ask you the question, you think well-being is a nice to have or a need to have? Now, the other element that we've studied is what it means to have a great job. Not just a job, but is it a job that you're engaged in, right? A job that you're excited to show up for every day. And like well-being, we've been able to quantify this through a handful of key metrics that if you strongly agree to these statements, right, you're more productive, you're less likely to be absent, sick, you stay longer in your organization, you have fewer safety incidents, you're less likely to steal. If we measure this in businesses, you drive more revenue and profit. That's the difference between an engaged employee, an engaged unit or team, and a not engaged unit or team. Now, I describe these things because they weave back powerfully to these 2 Latin roots of the word education. Now, in our research in doing this, right, in trying to quantify what it means to have a great job and a great life, we tested hundreds of questions that we thought might be linked to productivity in the workplace, right? Do you have a latte machine in the cafeteria? Is there a volleyball court out back? Do you get to ride a Segway scooter down the halls, right? I mean, I'm telling you, we've tested all this stuff. None of that stuff matters in the grand scheme of things, right? Not benefits, not even salary, right? There's a certain baseline level that you need on those things, but they're not the things that drive engagement in the workplace. So of these hundreds of questions we've tested across literally tens of millions of people around the globe on both of these domains, what does it mean to have a great job and a great life? Hundreds of questions. We've whittled the measurement of a great job down to 12. And on well-being, we've whittled it down to 10. Here's the amazing thing. Different measures, well-being and workplace engagement. Usually if you're thriving in well-being, you're engaged at work and vice versa, but they're different. Some people are suffering in their well-being and engaged at work, okay? Here's the amazing thing. It turns out of those handful of the most precious questions we've ever looked at, they share two in common. Here's what they are. In other words, these are both questions that if you strongly agree to these statements, they're a predictor of how you feel about your life and how engaged you are in your work. Here's what they are. You strongly agree that you have someone who encourages your development, and you strongly agree you have a chance to do what you're best at every day. These are the two most important statements for each of you to answer in this room, and these are the two most important statements for every student in every school in the United States to answer as well. They are fundamental. And as I describe them here, they get back to that rear or bring up, encourage my development. And how do you have a chance to do what you're best at each day if somebody hasn't led your potential out of you, to lead out of? See, talent is like a fingerprint. Each one of us has a unique talent signature. The real question is whether we ever apply those talents, because talents are like muscles. If you don't use them on a regular basis, they atrophy. How many students don't have the chance to use their talents? That's a question we should all be asking. Have we worked hard enough to identify what their natural talents are and to put those to work? Now, I'm going to segue to the research we have on what works in school at both the K-12 level and the higher ed level, and all of this is going to aim and point in direct ways to those two fundamental things I've shared with you. It turns out that when we do a representative study of 18 to 35-year-olds in the United States linked to their work success as young adults, there were two things that bubbled up in this huge study we did on 21st century skills. We asked all kinds of questions. Two of them doubled the odds that you end up successful in your work as a young American. Whether you say you worked on a long-term project that took more than a few classes to complete, and whether you had a chance to apply what you were learning to solving a real problem. Folks, this is not rocket science. This is not necessarily easy to do, but this is not rocket science. Now, what we've also learned is that any kind of work experience connected to learning is powerful. Not just a work experience by itself, a work experience connected to learning. Here's the problem. Less than 5% of students in high school have an internship with a local organization. Only 17% working an hour or more in a paid job in the last week. They are woefully unprepared as it comes to thinking about work experiences. And that's something I think we all need to think very carefully about. This is true, by the way, as I'll share the data with college students. Unfortunately, on one of the most important questions in the world, less than 50% of students in 5th through 12th grade strongly agree they have a chance to do what they're best at every day in school. We need to figure out how to move the needle on that metric. If they do strongly agree, though, it virtually wipes out disengagement in school. More than 8 in 10 who strongly agree their school is committed to building on the strengths of each student are engaged in school. And disengagement drops to 1%. You virtually eliminate disengagement if students feel that they have a chance to do what they're best at each day, that their school is committed to the strengths of each student. Here's a really special one for anybody who's a teacher in the room, because we found two key elements in our Gallup student poll that are a 30x finding. That if you strongly agree to the statement I just shared, and you say I have at least one teacher who makes me excited about the future. Remember I told you the definition of hope, one's ideas and energy for the future? Hope, it turns out, is contagious. If you're a hopeful person, you spread it to other people. If you're a hopeful teacher, importantly, you spread that to all the students in your classroom, to other teachers in your building. You get my point. But if students strongly agree to these two statements, they're 30 times as likely to be engaged in school. This would be I'd share this if this said 3x. This is a 30x finding, right? Think of the power 1 motivated teacher has who helps students get excited about the future. It's unbelievable. Now, I'm going to segue to higher ed, and I had a chance to speak at ECS 2 years ago when it was in Washington, D.C., and I shared this same chart. The data is now updated. It used to say 96, 14, 11. It now says 98, 13, 11. We asked a similar question in 3 different studies. One was provosts of college universities. And as you can see, they're fairly confident that they're doing a good job preparing students for success in the workplace. But when we asked a similar question of the general population of US adults, only 13% strongly agree that college graduates are well prepared for success in the workplace. And now you go, okay, well, you might be able to dismiss that. That's the general population. What do they know about the work readiness of college graduates? How about C-level business executives? 11% strongly agree. College graduates have the skills necessary to fill the roles they're looking for. Here's the point. I don't know how much of this gap is perception versus reality, but we've got to figure out how to bridge this gap. Because there's a huge difference in just our fundamental definition and understanding of what it means to be prepared for success in the workplace. That's a clear point. Employers writ large, higher education writ large, they're not even having conversations with one another. I know you can all point to a collaboration somewhere, but at a national level, we're not even having a conversation. We haven't clearly defined what we mean, and we're not collaborating on all the important things that might move the needle. Internships, co-op opportunities, externships for faculty or staff. What we did learn is that college graduates, this is the largest representative study of college graduates in US history, if they strongly agree to the 3 statements on the next slide, what we call being emotionally supported during college, it doubles the odds they end up engaged in their work and thriving in their well-being over their lifetime. Doubles the odds. Here's what they were. You strongly agreed you had at least one professor who made you excited about learning. Go ahead, give yourself this quiz right now. Right? These are 5-point statements. 5 strongly agree, 1 strongly disagree. I'm interested in how many of you strongly agree to any of these statements. Good news is 64% of all college graduates in the US strongly agree to that statement. The problem is what it also says that about 4 in 10 did not. And we're talking about one professor over 4 or 5 or, I don't know, 7 years, whatever that tenure in college might have been. The next one is a broader one. The professors at my alma mater cared about me as a person. Only 27% strongly agree to this one. The final one is the most important as the odds ratios go. It's a powerful one, right? How many of you in the room can strongly agree that during college you had a mentor who encouraged your goals and dreams? Raise your hand. How many in the room here? Oh, man. You guys are killing it. I mean, that was at least, in my formal Gallup poll, 40% of the audience, I think. This will be reported on Gallup.com tomorrow, by the way. Nationally, only 2 out of 10 strongly agree to that statement, which is to say that 8 out of 10 do not. Now, collectively, if you strongly agree to all 3 of these, you're a 14%er. That's the mark of US college graduates on these 3 critical questions. Now, the next 3 I'm going to share with you also double the odds of being engaged in work. So these are equally important to the previous 3 on workplace engagement. They don't have as powerful a relationship with well-being. Here's what they are. They're going to sound similar to the things I shared about some of the other studies. You strongly agree that you worked on a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. This one continues to kill me no matter how many times I present it, because the answer is less than a third of US college graduates strongly agree to that. And you go, what were they doing all 4 or 5 years? Taking pop quizzes and writing 5-page papers? Yes. I mean, I'm sorry, this one's inexcusable. Just go do an audit right now of all the courses that you teach at a college or university, right? Find out how many of them require a long-term project. Find out how many students could go through their major and never touch one of them. By the way, the reason why some of the students don't take these classes, here's the number 1 reason. It's not because they're lazy. That might be true for some of them. You know what the number 1 reason is? They don't want to get a bad grade in a harder, challenging course. Because they think the grade, the GPA, is more important than a challenging experience. You see the trade-offs we're making? That's a rational decision that parents and students are making, right? But they don't know the power of these challenging long-term experiences and projects. Or at least not as many of them appreciate it as there should be. The next 2 are interesting because they were sorting questions. One is, I had a job or an internship, this is the key part of the phrase, where I applied what I was learning in the classroom. We also asked in the study, did you have a paid job during college, yes or no? And if you said yes, that had no relationship with anything. Now, I'm not saying that was a bad experience. You earned some money, you were able to pay some of your bills. From that perspective, that job or internship could have been fantastic. But what moves the needle on workplace engagement later is whether you felt that work experience was connected to what you were learning. This is where all the magic happens. And by the way, the only way you can measure that is by asking the student or graduate, him or herself. I can measure if they had an internship, I can put that in a co-curricular transcript, but I only know if they felt it applied what they were learning if you go out and you ask that person themselves. There's no other way to measure this. Behavioral economics is about measuring the key constituents in education. Students, the teachers, the staff, the graduates, right? We need to pay much closer attention to all of these key constituents. So here's what's crazy about this data. So if you look on the right, the darker bars are the percent of college graduates who strongly agreed to all 6 of these key ingredients. By the way, I brushed over the last one. You were extremely involved in extracurricular activity. Not just check the box, but separate statement, I was extremely involved. See the difference? You could have said I played intramural sports, but if you didn't separately say I was extreme, it's about deep involvement. Percent of college graduates who strongly agreed to all 6 of these precious experiences, let's say, it's 3%. But for those graduates who strongly agreed to all 6, we asked another question in the survey, whether they felt well prepared for life outside of college. Isn't that just a great direct question, whether you felt well prepared for life outside of college? If you hit the mark on all 6 of these, 85% of those graduates strongly agree they were well prepared for life outside of college. Look on the other end. Almost a quarter of all college graduates are a 0 on this critical 6-question scale that we've uncovered. Zippo, a quarter of them. And for those graduates, only 5% strongly agree they were well prepared for life outside of college. This is crazy because 100% of the people in this data set met the academic requirements to receive a diploma from their institution. In this study, I'm not studying college dropouts, I'm looking at those who graduated. They all got a diploma, and the difference in their feelings that they were well prepared is between 5 and 85%. It's a 17x differential. That's insane. These are critical elements that we need to start to bring into focus on top of all the other classic economic indicators that we're measuring. So if we go back to this, right, the Latin roots of the word, right, to rear or bring up, it fundamentally aligns with one of the 2 most important questions in all of Gallup's research. Whether you feel you have someone who encourages your development. That could be a parent, a teacher, a fellow student, a janitor, right? Frankly, I don't care who it is. What I care most about is that somebody feels they have that in their life. And the other one, right, to draw out from within or to lead out of, is how do you get to that place where you know and feel that you're doing what you're best at each day? Now, you've got to try a lot of things, right? You've got to experience a lot of things. You've got to work on things over a long period of time. You have to have in-depth experiences to get there. So if I just try to oversimplify complex research and get us focused back on how do we peel away some of the overcomplications we've created in our education system, this would be my list of things we would focus on. Almost exclusively. Almost exclusively. So first of all, you know the expression, content is king? That's BS. Caring is king. Period, end of story. What we teach is important. Thank you. Don't get me wrong, what we teach matters, but it matters less than how we teach it, which matters less than why we teach it, what our motivations are for teaching, what the students' motivations are for learning, and that matters less than who teaches it. So if you want to go in order, it's who, why, how, what. Guess what we've been focused on for the last decade in the United States? What. And I'm not saying that that's been futility, right? But by focusing purely on what, we've lost sight of all those other fundamental layers that underpin it. I love this because we have an expression in higher education for how you get tenure. What is it called? It's called publish or perish. I have a new idea. Mentor or meander. This is fundamentally about generating excitement for the future. If you haven't asked a student what they want to do, who they want to be, right, what makes them excited, you're missing the most fundamental pole position, the starting place of how to help them grow and develop. I mean, think of how simple that is, just to show up and start to ask people what they're excited about. That is a fundamental driver. And here's one of the big insights from our research about how people become successful. This is a simple story. People focus on their strengths, not their weaknesses. People who focus on fixing weaknesses, at best, can get to average performance. That's the best you can hope for. But if you figure out what your natural talents are, and you focus on those develop infinitely. By the way, when I say weakness and strength, I'm not talking about if a kid can't read, that we don't worry about helping them learn how to read. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is figure out the things that come natural to them. Because all of us know there's certain things that came more naturally to us than other things. We had to work harder, and in some things, we're just never going to get to excellence. We might get to basic, but it's to figure out the things that come naturally to us and to put those on turbocharge. Not to perseverate over weaknesses, but to figure out how we build on strengths. And on the do what I do best every day, right, you fundamentally have to get to that place by discovering what that is, right? By actually applying yourself and going, well, I did an internship there and I decided that's not for me. I'm not very good at that. What do we do in college? See, we have the immersion experiences senior year, the capstone courses, the internships. We go through weed out courses in the first couple of years, and then we have the real signature in-depth experience. So if you want to be a chemical engineer, you go through all kinds of weed out classes, and then senior year, you actually go and figure out what does a chemical engineer do, and you go, oh, never mind. Or you go, I love chemical engineering, right? But think of the power. If you found out that you really love chemical engineering freshman year, that powers you through all those weed out classes in a much more powerful way. So some of the best STEM programs in higher ed right now, that's what they're doing. They're flipping the capstone experience to the very first thing, and then you go through the weed out classes. This is about project-based learning. It's about applying what you're learning to solving a real problem. We can do this in every single class, from Intro to Spanish to all the obvious programs in STEM. I think we've kind of locked ourselves into thinking this only happens in STEM. Not true at all. You look at the new tech high schools out there, everybody thinks it's a story about technology. It sort of is. It's really a story about project-based learning. It's amazing. We can all do this. We just need to figure out how we apply it to all the content we teach. I'm not saying we teach different content. We can teach the same content, we just need to weave it into how we teach it, project-based learning in every single class. And it's fundamentally about finding more work experiences to connect students to. Whether that's an internship, a co-op, right? Here's a crazy idea. What if we had externships for teachers and faculty? Because guess what? The smart ones will definitely figure out how to do a better job connecting the teaching in their classroom to work experiences, right, that students are going to be better prepared for. If they have exposure an understanding of what a real workplace looks like outside of academia or outside of a school. These are things that are relatively easy for us to fix. They don't require huge budgets. These are not billion-dollar school bonds for building new buildings and campuses. This is stuff that's a change in what we value and in how we spend our time. That's my best news for you, right? If you're disappointed by how we rate on some of these metrics, the best news I have for you is this is a change in what we value and how we spend our time. This is not solved by dollars. Thank you all for the incredible work that you're doing, and it was a pleasure to be here with you this morning.